Hello and welcome again. In this presentation, I want to talk about the recovery process and our treatment process overall. So the recovery process, there's six stages of recovery: recognition, admission, petition, acceptance, volition, and conversion. So the first stage in recovery, recognition, is what we're really trying to work on when intervening in somebody's drug use. We're simply trying to help them recognize this as a problem in their life. We're not expecting that they be completely sober in the beginning. We're not expecting that they totally own and understand that they have a substance abuse problem or an addiction that needs to be addressed. We're working on helping them to recognize that, and that's what the intervention phase of treatment's all about. What you've already heard about: the chemical use assessment, the drug testing, the counseling process. And I'll touch on that again in just a minute. So the first step, recognition, is simply helping the user to try to recognize this as an issue in their life. When they get to a place where they do recognize that their substance use has created consequences in their life, that they can see the effects it's had with family, school, friends, health, social life, mental health, sports, relationships in different areas, and maybe they're being clean now because they're being drug tested, so they also recognize that, wow, consequences aren't occurring again. Maybe trust is coming back with family and other relationships as well. So they start to really see this as an issue. When they personalize it and own it and really then admit it as a problem, which is stage 2, now there's the start of a little bit of grief and loss for them. It's the start of recognizing that they need to let go of this and admitting this is their problem, not their family's problem, not their friend's problem, but this is their problem, their issue that they need to work on. So with that is the letting go of a relationship to intoxication. This relationship to intoxication has always been there for them. It's responded to their needs when they've needed to be soothed, when they needed to be energized, when they needed to be around people. Drug culture was always there, and so now, and maybe they've even built their own identity around drug use and drug culture to some degree, and so now there's this loss of this way to connect with people with drugs, this way for me to cope with my emotions by using drugs, and maybe even part of my identity as well. So with that is the start of some grief and loss, just typical stages of grief and loss. Some denial, some anger, some bargaining, and that kind of occurs in the admission stage of recovery. When they've been hanging out for a little while, they've been showing up to counseling, they've recognized this as a problem, they've personalized it and owned it as their own, they've worked through some of what it's going to be like to be clean, they've got some hope that things can get better. Then the third stage is petition, and petition literally means seeking help, that they're starting to see that they need to be attending counseling. So stage 1 and 2, the level of motivation, we're on the right hand side of this presentation, it says levels of motivation. For recognition and admission, stages 1 and 2, the level of motivation is, I'm doing this because I have to. I don't see that I have a problem, I don't want to quit, I'm only doing this because I have to. What creates the have to? Family's going to set limits. The legal system, probation officers said get sober. The job said, hey, be clean on drug screens or you're out of here. So they're doing it because they have to. But they've now worked on recognizing the consequences. They've stayed clean. And now petition is, and acceptance is, I'm doing this because I recognize I need to. I haven't totally surrendered to drugs yet. I still would like to use them if I could, but I can see that it has created consequences for me and that things can really change if I stick to this and move forward. So petition is literally seeking help. They know when their counseling appointments are, they're reminding family of it, maybe they're attending 12-step meetings at this point in time, and that's become part of the routine in their life, and they're using their time in the sessions to really explore instead of defend their substance use. Number 4 is acceptance, along the same levels of motivation, doing this because I recognize I need to. But acceptance is when there's no more grief and loss associated with it. So as I said, in in the stage number 2 admission, that when people start to personalize and own this, that there's grief and loss that takes place, maybe even some shame, maybe some guilt. And the same way for family too. I mean, these stages of recovery aren't just for the drug user, but they're the same for the codependency recovery process, recognizing your own denial and enabling, recognizing your own codependency, owning it as your own, understanding it better, seeking help and counseling, Al-Anon support, and then being able to talk about this with other people without shame and guilt. And that's the acceptance stage. You know, a lot of times in families where there's addiction, people have too much shame to talk about this with friends, coworkers, and other people outside of the home, let alone in the home. So that's acceptance. They've accepted that this is okay. People with dignity, good people, can have this bad illness. This is what I'm dealing with. This is what our family's dealing with, and we're okay. Volition literally means free will. So now the level of motivation for recovery for 5 and 6, the level of motivation is I'm doing this because I want to. I recognize that things are different for me now. The way I relate to myself, the way I relate to others is much better. I have new coping skills, new passions, a new way of life, and finally conversion is I have a new life. So at this stage is I'm doing this because I want to. So if you kind of think back, in one of the presentations earlier, I said that sometimes people are under the impression that we can't help people get clean unless they want to quit. And that is not necessarily the case at all. It is our job to simply help them recognize this as a problem. That's the first stage. And then hopefully they can internalize that a little bit more and personalize that a little bit more and admit it, and then buy into the recovery process, do the work, and then they will be doing this because they want to. So the want to level of motivation is near the last stage of motivation for people. In our counseling process specifically, what we're doing in the beginning is the intervention phase to help them recognize this as a problem. That's what you learned about in the chemical use assessment presentation. And even if you're not in this counseling process, that chemical use assessment presentation is a helpful tool to intervene in someone's belief about their drug use, to help point out to them how it's created consequences in their life. For us specifically here, we do that. We have the family present that to the user. We work with them to examine closely the consequences of their use. And we build up to a family session where that can be talked about with family members. The implementation of the setting limits contract, the home contract, which was talked about in a previous presentation as well, is part of the intervention phase, and so is drug testing. If the user can start to stay clean and get sober, then we want to work on feelings assessment. You heard about in the video, one of the video presentations of mine, I think it was video number 2, looking at experimentation, misuse, abuse, and addiction, that substance abuse is an emotional illness. So we need to help them repair the emotional illness. You know, you can make it through the intervention stage of treatment, and maybe they've been clean for 30 or 60 days now, but the work isn't over yet. They really have to start digging into some of their motivations around use, and also connecting to their own emotions and finding other coping skills. I strongly subscribe to the notion that one way of looking at substance use is as an affect regulation disorder. What is affect regulation? It means the ability to regulate how you feel. And so whether the addiction is drug abuse, workaholism, sex addiction, spending, gambling, you name it, a lot of times those are ways those are things that people engage in to change the way that they feel, to fill a void, to run from loneliness, to feel adequate, to feel powerful, to feel competent, or to avoid feelings of shame or avoid feelings of depression. But ultimately, those are self-destructive ways to change how they feel, and we need to actually help them stop running away from the emotions, the unpleasant emotions, but simply at first learn how to identify them, experience them, which is hard for a lot of people to do, express them and cope with them, and turn to others to help regulate them in a healthy way. So instead of turning away from the emotions, we actually want people to turn into them and be with it, own it, talk about it. Where do they feel it in their body? How does it affect them? How does it influence their behaviors? And what are the emotions that are hardest to sit with? Boredom for some people is challenging. Depression is challenging. Loneliness is challenging. And the flip side, positive emotions can be hard for some people to be with. Excitement, accomplishment, and other emotions can be hard for people to be with as well. So the feelings assessment of treatment is the start of learning to identify, build a feelings vocabulary, identify emotions, talk about how to understand them, why it's important